Good morning. Today I'm going to summarize the main ideas of David Blair's What Happens in Macbeth Act 1, Scene 7. In this presentation, there are three things to focus on. What motivates Macbeth to kill Duncan? What is the ornament of life? And how does Lady Macbeth convince her husband to kill Duncan? Act 1, Scene 7 opens with Macbeth expressing his inner conflict about whether or not to kill the king. In this speech, Macbeth says nothing pushes him to murder Duncan except his own vaulting ambition. Many read this and assume that Macbeth's fatal flaw is ambition. But David Blair argues that Lady Macbeth taps into another, deeper desire that is actually driving her husband. According to Blair, the witch's prediction means that fate has guaranteed that Macbeth will be king, so murdering Duncan isn't necessary. Macbeth's hesitation is not about whether or not he wants to be king enough to commit murder. Instead, it is a choice to either take action directly or to passively let fate hand him the crown. In Act 1, Scene 7, Lady Macbeth says these lines. For Blair, the key word here is "and" in line 43. As Blair interprets it, Lady Macbeth is saying, would you be happy to have what you want while also seeing yourself as a coward? Lady Macbeth seems to imply that her husband would not be satisfied to passively receive the crown. If this is true, then the play is not about Macbeth's ambition. Instead, it is emphasizing the issue of self-determination. This interpretation is supported by Act 1, Scene 2, when Macbeth is described in battle as someone who disdains fortune and carves out his own passage. In this early scene, Macbeth is described as someone who will not passively let fate determine the outcome of the battle. Instead, he is the kind of man who will push forward and earn a victory even when defeat seems inevitable. But the kind of bold action that makes Macbeth a respected general would not necessarily earn him respect as a king. Blair suggests that for Macbeth to seize the crown in the same way that he sees the victory on the battlefield would be perceived as immoral. In the eyes of the other characters, a leader who was this forceful in seizing control would be considered unworthy to rule. So Macbeth's choice is whether he will choose to shape his own destiny, as he did on the battlefield, or whether he will choose to maintain his good reputation among his peers. Understanding the choice in this way gives depth to Lady Macbeth's discussion of the ornament of life. The ornament of life doesn't have to be the crown. Instead, it could be the judgments that Macbeth's peers would make of him. In other words, Macbeth seems to be wrestling with the idea of murdering Duncan, not because he's concerned about the immorality of murder, but because he is afraid of what people would think of him. Lady Macbeth is saying that Macbeth's reputation in the eyes of others is worthless if he despises himself for failing to be a man of action. Amanda Mobiliar disagrees with Blair's interpretation. She claims that it is only in the first half of Macbeth's monologue that he's focused on what others will think of him. She believes that in the latter half of the speech, Macbeth is focused on the immorality of betraying someone who is a benevolent ruler, honest man, and good friend. In her view, Macbeth recognizes that his choice is immoral, but he chooses to murder because of his ambition. But Blair is not alone in focusing on the issue of reputation. Thomas Mark Parrott explained that interpreting the ornament of life as referring to the golden opinions from all sorts of people is probably the better interpretation. In conclusion, Lady Macbeth is suggesting that her husband cannot fully be who he is, a man of action who seeks to defy fate, while being concerned about the opinions of others. Her argument is that it's more important for Macbeth to be true to himself than to focus on morality or anything else. This interpretation, seeing Macbeth as a man driven to control his own destiny, gives this speech in Act 5 a new meaning. Here Macbeth seems to be lamenting that he cannot control his own fate, that everything in the past has inevitably shaped the way that things will end up. All of the actions we take in life are empty and meaningless because everything has already been determined. Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So then in Blair's analysis, number 1, Macbeth is motivated to kill Duncan because he seeks to control his own destiny. Number 2, the ornament of life that he desires is a good reputation, and these two things seem to be in contradiction. The inciting incident in the play is when Macbeth must choose one or the other. So number 3, Lady Macbeth convinces her husband to kill Duncan by telling him that being true to himself is more important than anything else. And I think that Blair's analysis makes sense. I think that as human beings, we often don't fully know ourselves. So even though Macbeth says that ambition is pushing him forward, he may not fully understand what's motivating him. The most convincing evidence to me is that Blair's interpretation makes Macbeth's Act 5 speech more meaningful and more powerful than if it's simply a commentary on morality. Finally, I think that this interpretation is very internally consistent, taking into account both the way that Shakespeare first introduced the character of Macbeth and the way that he conveyed Macbeth's internal struggles in his monologues. So in conclusion, I agree with Blair that the central issue of the play is Macbeth's desire to control his own destiny. Thank you.